In the frigid waters off the coast of Chile, on March 14, 1915, a German warship was dying. The SMS Dresden, a light cruiser that had survived the catastrophic Battle of the Falkland Islands 3 months earlier, now found herself cornered in Cumberland Bay. British shells tore through her hull, igniting fires that consumed deck after deck. Sailors scrambled for lifeboats. Officers shouted orders that were lost in the thunder of explosions. And somewhere amid the chaos, a young pig fought for her life. Her name was TIRPITZ. She had been aboard the Dresden since the ship's commissioning, a mascot of the Imperial German Navy, named mockingly after the Grand Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, who had built Germany's naval might. She was not a pet in the traditional sense. She was livestock, meant eventually for the dinner table, but in the strange alchemy of war, she had become something more. The crew had grown fond of her. They fed her scraps. They scratched behind her ears. In the long weeks at sea, far from home, she had become a small comfort, a living reminder of farms and families, and a world beyond steel and salt water. Now that world was ending. The Dresden had been running for months. After the disaster at the Falklands, where Admiral von Spee's squadron had been annihilated by superior British forces, the Dresden was the sole survivor. She had fled into the labyrinth of channels and fjords along the Chilean coast, a ghost ship playing a deadly game of hide and seek with the Royal Navy. Her coal was nearly exhausted. Her crew was starving. Her engines were failing. The British had finally found her, and they showed no mercy. The first shell struck just after 9 in the morning. The Dresden's captain, Fritz Ludeck, knew his ship was doomed. He had already sent a message to the British squadron, hoping to negotiate an internment in neutral Chile rather than face destruction. But the British commander, Captain John Luce of HMS Glasgow, had no patience for negotiations. He had been hunting the Dresden for 3 months. He opened fire. The German crew fought back briefly, but their guns were outmatched and their ammunition low. Within minutes, Captain Ludeck ordered the scuttling charges set. If the Dresden was to die, she would die by German hands, not British. The charges were placed. The fuses were lit. And then came the order every sailor dreads: abandon ship. Men poured over the railings, dropping into lifeboats or simply jumping into the icy water. The Dresden was settling fast, her stern already submerged, her bow rising at a grotesque angle. Steam hissed from ruptured pipes. Oil spread across the water in dark rainbows. And Tirpitz, terrified and confused, found herself in the water. Pigs are not natural swimmers, but they are surprisingly capable when survival demands it. Tirpitz paddled frantically, her snout just above the surface, her legs churning beneath her. Around her, the sea was a nightmare of debris and drowning men. Pieces of the Dresden floated past, wood rope, personal belongings, bodies. The water was so cold it stole the breath from your lungs. Many German sailors died within minutes of entering it, their muscles seizing, their hearts stopping. But Tirpitz kept swimming. She did not understand what was happening. She did not know why the world had exploded into noise and fire. She knew only that she had to reach something solid, something safe. Her instincts drove her forward. And then, through the smoke and spray, she saw it, a boat. It was a British cutter from HMS Glasgow, moving through the wreckage to pick up survivors. The British sailors were pulling German sailors from the water, hauling them aboard with practiced efficiency. These men were enemies, yes, but they were also drowning, and there are codes that govern the sea. You save who you can. One of the British sailors, a young seaman whose name has been lost to history, spotted the pig. He pointed and shouted. His crewmates looked, and for a moment, in the middle of this scene of death and destruction, they laughed. It was absurd. It was impossible. It was a pig, swimming through a naval battle. They hauled her aboard. Tirpitz collapsed onto the deck of the cutter, exhausted and shivering. The British sailors stared at her. One of them draped a coat over her. Another found a piece of biscuit and offered it. She ate. And in that moment, she ceased to be a German mascot and became something else entirely, a prisoner of war. The HMS Glasgow had been at sea for months, hunting the Dresden across thousands of miles of ocean. She was a town-class light cruiser, fast and well-armed, one of the workhorses of the Royal Navy. Her crew had endured storms, mechanical failures, and the constant strain of pursuit. They had lost friends in the Battle of Coronel, where von Spee's squadron had defeated a British force in one of the Royal Navy's most humiliating defeats of the war. They had avenged those losses at the Falklands, where von Spee himself had gone down with his flagship. And now, finally, they had cornered and destroyed the last of his squadron. They were exhausted. They were hungry. And now they had a pig. When the cutter returned to the Glasgow with its cargo of German survivors and one waterlogged pig, the reaction was mixed. Some men laughed. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Captain Luce, a stern and proper officer, reportedly raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The pig was technically enemy property, captured in combat. That made her a prize of war. The crew of the Glasgow adopted her immediately. They dried her off. They found her a place on deck, away from the machinery, but close enough to the galley that she could be fed. Someone suggested they name her after the German admiral whose ship they had just destroyed. But the name TIRPITZ was already in use, not for the Dresden, but for the admiral himself, a man deeply unpopular in Britain, blamed for the naval arms race that had helped bring about the war. To name a captured pig after him was perfect British irony. TIRPITZ the pig was born. She adapted quickly to life aboard the Glasgow. Pigs are intelligent animals, far more so than most people realize. They can recognize individual humans, learn routines, and even solve simple problems. TIRPITZ learned which sailors would feed her and which would scratch behind her ears. She learned to stay out of the way during drills. She learned the rhythms of shipboard life, the bells that marked the watches, the pipe calls that summoned the crew, the sudden silences that meant danger. The sailors, for their part, doted on her. Life aboard a warship in 1915 was brutal. The food was monotonous and often rotten. The quarters were cramped and filthy. Disease was rampant. Combat was terrifying. And so any small comfort, any source of amusement or affection, became precious. TIRPITZ was that comfort. She was something to care for, something to laugh about, something that reminded them of home. She became a mascot in the truest sense. Mascots in the military serve a function beyond mere entertainment. They are symbols of luck, of continuity, of the shared experience that binds a unit together. The Glasgow's crew had been through hell. They had fought and bled and watched their friends die. TIRPITZ, this ridiculous, impossible survivor, became a symbol of their own resilience. If a pig could survive the sinking of an enemy warship, if she could swim through a battlefield and come out the other side, then maybe they could too. The journey back to Britain took weeks. The Glasgow sailed north, across the equator, through the Atlantic, past the U-boat hunting grounds, and finally into British waters. TIRPITZ made the entire voyage. By the time they reached port, she was a celebrity. Word of TIRPITZ had spread through the fleet even before the Glasgow reached home. Radio messages between ships carried the story. A pig, captured from a German cruiser, now living aboard HMS Glasgow. It was the kind of story that traveled fast in wartime, a bright spot of absurdity and humor in an otherwise grim conflict. Newspapers picked it up. Reporters began asking questions. And when the Glasgow finally docked in Portsmouth in May of 1915, TIRPITZ was waiting for her close-up. The British press loved her. This was a nation that adored animals, that had built an empire partly on the strength of its cavalry horses and messenger pigeons and faithful dogs. The story of TIRPITZ fit perfectly into a narrative that the British people desperately wanted to believe, that even in the midst of a brutal industrial war, there was still room for decency, for humor, for kindness. A captured pig, treated well by British sailors, was proof that Britain was fighting the good fight, that its men were civilized and humane even in combat. The reality, of course, was more complicated. The war was not humane. It was mechanized slaughter on a scale the world had never seen. Millions were dying in the trenches of France and Belgium. Poison gas was being used. Zeppelins were bombing cities. The old rules of war, the codes of chivalry and honor that had governed European conflict for centuries, were collapsing under the weight of machine guns and artillery. But people needed stories that told them otherwise. They needed to believe that humanity still mattered. Tirpitz gave them that. She was photographed. She was interviewed, in the sense that reporters wrote whimsical articles imagining her thoughts and feelings. She was visited by dignitaries. And then, in a stroke of marketing genius, someone had the idea to auction her off for charity. War charities were a major part of the British home front effort. Organizations raised money for wounded soldiers, for widows and orphans, for hospitals and relief funds. Auctions of donated goods were common, but an auction of a living, breathing German prisoner of war, even one with 4 legs and a curly tail, was unprecedented. It was decided that Tirpitz would be sold to the highest bidder, with all proceeds going to the Red Cross. The auction was held in London in the autumn of 1915. It was a major event covered by newspapers across the country. Bidders included wealthy businessmen, aristocrats, and military officers. The atmosphere was festive, almost carnival-like. This was a chance to own a piece of history, to take home a genuine war trophy, and to support a good cause all at the same time. The bidding was fierce. Tirpitz, groomed and well-fed, was paraded before the crowd. She seemed unbothered by the attention, snuffling at the ground and occasionally grunting. The auctioneer played up her story, describing her heroic swim, her capture by British sailors, her months aboard HMS Glasgow. The price climbed higher and higher. In the end, Tirpitz was sold for over £1,700, an enormous sum in 1915, equivalent to well over £100,000 today. The buyer was a consortium of business owners who intended to tour her around the country, charging admission and raising even more money for charity. Tirpitz, who had started her life as anonymous livestock aboard a German warship, was now one of the most famous animals in Britain. Her tour was a sensation. Tirpitz traveled from town to town, appearing at fairs, agricultural shows, and charity events. People lined up to see her, to touch her, to take photographs. Children loved her. Veterans, some of them missing limbs or bearing terrible scars, came to see the pig who had survived a naval battle. For many of them, Tirpitz was a reminder that survival was possible, that even in the middle of chaos and violence, life could endure. She was well cared for during her travels. Her handlers made sure she was fed and housed properly. She grew fat and healthy, a far cry from the terrified, half-drowned creature who had been pulled from the waters off Chile. And everywhere she went, she raised money. Thousands of pounds flowed into the Red Cross coffers, money that paid for ambulances and medical supplies and food for refugees. But the tour could not last forever. By 1916, the novelty had worn off. The war was dragging on. The initial enthusiasm and optimism of 1914 had curdled into grim determination and exhaustion. The stories that had seemed charming in 1915 now felt trivial in the face of the Somme, where tens of thousands of British soldiers died in a single day. Tirpitz was still famous, but her fame no longer translated into crowds and donations the way it once had. It was decided that she would be auctioned again, one final time, to a permanent home. This second auction was smaller, quieter, less of a spectacle. Tirpitz was purchased by a private buyer, a farmer in the countryside who promised to give her a good life. And for a time, she had one. She lived on that farm for the rest of her days, a pampered and spoiled pig, far removed from the war that had made her famous. She had survived where so many had not. The SMS Dresden, the ship that had carried her across the Pacific, was a rusted wreck on the bottom of Cumberland Bay, her crew scattered to prison camps or returned to a defeated Germany. The sailors of HMS Glasgow, the men who had pulled her from the water and cared for her, were scattered as well. Some had been killed in later battles. Others had survived the war but carried its scars for the rest of their lives. Tirpitz, alone among them, lived in peace. She died sometime in the early 1920s, the exact date unrecorded. By then, the war had been over for years. The world was trying to forget, trying to move on. The roaring 20s were in full swing. a desperate attempt to bury the trauma of the war years under jazz and dancing and willful amnesia. TIRPITZ, the famous pig POW, was largely forgotten. There were no obituaries, no memorials, no statues erected in her honor. But her story did not entirely disappear. It was recorded in naval histories, in the logs of HMS Glasgow, in newspaper archives. And over the years, it has been rediscovered, retold, passed down as one of the stranger footnotes of the First World War. Because TIRPITZ's story, for all its absurdity, tells us something important about the nature of war and the people who fight it. War is a human invention, but it is not a purely human experience. Animals have always been caught up in our conflicts, whether as deliberate participants, the horses and dogs and pigeons we have pressed into service, or as innocent bystanders swept up in the chaos. TIRPITZ was both. She was cargo, livestock, intended to feed the crew of a German warship. She had no stake in the war, no understanding of the ideologies and national rivalries that had set the world on fire. She was simply there in the wrong place at the wrong time. And yet, because she survived, because she was captured and cared for and celebrated, she became something more. She became a symbol. For the British public, she was proof of their nation's humanity, evidence that even in the midst of a total war, British sailors would pull a drowning pig from the water and treat her kindly. For the sailors of HMS Glasgow, she was a mascot and a companion, a living reminder that not everything in war was grim and brutal. And for the German crew of the Dresden, the few who survived and heard of her later, she must have been a bittersweet memory, a link to a ship and a time that was gone forever. The story of TIRPITZ also reveals something about the role of propaganda and narrative in wartime. The British press made much of her capture and her treatment, using her story to reinforce the idea that Britain was fighting a just and honorable war. This was, of course, selective storytelling. The same British Navy that rescued and cared for TIRPITZ was also enforcing a naval blockade of Germany that would eventually starve hundreds of thousands of German civilians. The same British soldiers who sent money to the Red Cross to support TIRPITZ's charity tour were also fighting in trenches where poison gas and flamethrowers were routine weapons. War is never clean, never simple, never as humane as we want it to be. But humans need stories. We need narratives that make sense of chaos, that give meaning to suffering, that allow us to see ourselves as the heroes of our own lives. TIRPITZ provided that. She was a story that could be told without caveats, without moral complexity. A pig survived. She was rescued. She was cared for. She raised money for charity. Everyone could feel good about that. And there is nothing wrong with feeling good, even in the middle of a war. In fact, it is essential. Hope, humor, and small acts of kindness are what allow people to endure the unendurable. The sailors of HMS Glasgow were not naive. They knew what war was. They had seen men die. They had killed. But they also knew that if they lost their humanity entirely, if they became nothing more than killing machines, then the war had already destroyed them. Caring for a pig, as ridiculous as it might sound, was a way of holding on to that humanity. TIRPITZ's story also reminds us of the randomness of survival. Why did she live when so many others died? She was no braver than the German sailors who drowned in Cumberland Bay. She was no more deserving of life than the British sailors who would die in later battles. She simply got lucky. She was in the right place. She was seen. She was pulled aboard. Survival in war is often like that, not a matter of courage or skill or virtue, but simply a roll of the dice. In the decades since World War I, TIRPITZ has been remembered sporadically. She appears in books about naval history, in collections of strange but true war stories, in articles about animals in conflict. She has never achieved the lasting fame of some other war animals, Sergeant Stubby, the American dog who served in the trenches, or Wojciech, the Polish soldier bear of World War II. But her story endures, passed along by those who find in it something worth preserving. What that something is depends on the listener. For some, TIRPITZ is simply a charming oddity, a bit of trivia to share at parties. For others, she is a reminder of the human capacity for compassion, even in the darkest times. For still others, she is a symbol of survival against the odds, a reminder that sometimes, against all logic and probability, life endures. There is also a darker reading of her story, one that cannot be ignored. Tirpitz was celebrated while millions died. She was pampered and photographed while soldiers rotted in trenches, while cities were bombed, while entire generations of young men were fed into the meat grinder of industrial war. There is something almost obscene about the contrast. The British public could raise thousands of pounds for a pig while ignoring or downplaying the suffering of their own soldiers and the civilians caught in the war's path. But this, too, is a part of the human experience of war. We cannot face horror unblinkingly, not for long. We need breaks. We need distractions. We need stories that are not about death and suffering. Tirpitz was that story. She was a brief respite from the grimness, a moment of levity in a time that had very little to offer. To condemn that impulse, to say that people should have ignored Tirpitz and focused only on the serious matters of the war, is to misunderstand how human beings function under sustained trauma. We are not built to endure constant horror. We need joy, humor, absurdity. We need to care for something small and vulnerable. We need to believe that kindness still matters. Tirpitz allowed people to feel those things, and that mattered. It is also worth noting that the money raised by Tirpitz's auctions and tours went to real, tangible aid. The Red Cross used those funds to save lives, to ease suffering. In that sense, Tirpitz did contribute to the war effort, albeit in a way that no one could have predicted. She was not a soldier. She did not fight, but she served. The broader history of animals in war is a long and often tragic one. Horses died by the millions in World War I, blown apart by artillery, or worked to death hauling supplies. Dogs were used as messengers, carrying orders through machine gun fire. Pigeons flew through storms and shrapnel to deliver critical intelligence. Elephants, camels, mules, even glowworms were pressed into service. Some were honored for their service. Many were simply used and discarded. Tirpitz was lucky in this regard as well. She was never asked to work. She was never in danger again after her initial capture. She lived out her life in comfort, a rare fate for an animal caught up in war. This, too, is worth remembering. For every Tirpitz, there are thousands of animals who suffered and died without recognition, without names, without stories. So, what do we make of Tirpitz now, more than a century after her famous swim? What does her story mean to us today, in a world that has seen even greater wars, even more advanced weapons, even more industrialized killing? Perhaps the answer is that her story means exactly what it meant in 1915, that survival is worth celebrating, that kindness is worth practicing, and that even in the midst of chaos, there is room for compassion. These are not revolutionary insights. They are not going to change the world or prevent the next war. But they are true, and they are important. Tirpitz's story also serves as a reminder of the power of narrative. She was objectively just a pig. She did nothing heroic. She did not save lives or win battles. She simply survived and was lucky enough to be noticed. But the story that grew around her, the meanings that people attached to her, made her significant. She became a symbol, and symbols have power. They shape how we think about events. They influence how we remember the past. They help us make sense of experiences that are too big and too terrible to grasp in their entirety. The First World War was one of those experiences. It was too vast, too destructive, too senseless to comprehend. Millions dead, empires destroyed, entire societies traumatized. How do you process that? How do you hold it in your mind without going mad? One way is to find smaller stories, human-scale stories, stories with beginnings and middles and ends that make sense. Tirpitz's story is one of those. It is small enough to understand, simple enough to retell, and just strange enough to be memorable. But we should also be careful not to let stories like Tirpitz's obscure the larger truths of war. Yes, British sailors pulled a pig from the water and cared for her. That is admirable. But the same war also saw those sailors' comrades gassed, shot, burned, and drowned. It saw civilians starved by blockades and bombed by zeppelins. It saw the deliberate targeting of merchant ships and the deaths of thousands of non-combatants. The kindness shown to Tirpitz does not erase those horrors, and should not be used as evidence that the war was anything other than a catastrophe. What it does show is that even in catastrophes, people try to hold on to their humanity. Not always, not everyone, but often enough that it is worth noting. The sailors of HMS Glasgow did not have to rescue Tirpitz. They could have left her to drown. They could have eaten her, but they did not. They pulled her aboard, dried her off, fed her, and made her part of their crew. That was a choice. It was a small choice in the grand scheme of things, but it mattered. Tirpitz lived. She survived. And in surviving, she gave people something to care about, something to smile about, something to hope for. That is not nothing. In a war that destroyed so much, that took so many lives and ruined so many others, the survival of one pig is a tiny victory. But it is a victory nonetheless. In researching Tirpitz's story, one encounters frustrating gaps in the historical record. We know the broad strokes: the sinking of the Dresden, the rescue of the pig, her time aboard HMS Glasgow, her auctions and tours, her eventual retirement to a farm. But the details are often missing. We do not know which specific sailors pulled her from the water. We do not know the exact date of her death. We do not know what happened to most of the Dresden's crew after the war. This is typical of history, especially the history of ordinary people and animals. The records that survive are the ones that someone thought were important enough to preserve. Official naval logs, newspaper articles, propaganda materials, these things were saved. Personal letters, diary entries, the memories of enlisted sailors, these things were often lost. And so we are left with a story that is tantalizing in its outlines, but frustratingly vague in its specifics. What we do know is that Tirpitz's story captured the public imagination in a way that few other animal stories did. She was written about in newspapers across Britain and beyond. She was featured in books and articles. Her image appeared on postcards and charity posters. For a brief moment in 1915 and 1916, she was genuinely famous. That fame faded, as fame always does. New stories replaced the old ones. The war ground on. Tirpitz retired from public life and lived out her days in obscurity. But the fact that her story has been remembered at all, that it has been passed down and retold, suggests that it touched something deep in the people who heard it. Perhaps what Tirpitz represented was the possibility of transformation. She began her life as German property, an animal marked for slaughter. She ended it as a British celebrity, living in comfort and raising money for charity. She crossed from one side of the war to the other, not as a traitor or a defector. She had no agency in the matter, but simply as a survivor who was taken in and cared for. In a war that was defined by rigid divisions, by us versus them, by national hatreds and propaganda, Tirpitz was a figure who transcended those boundaries. She was German, then British, then simply a pig living on a farm. She belonged to everyone and no one. This ability to cross boundaries, to be claimed by multiple sides, is rare in war. Most stories are partisan. They are told to glorify one side and demonize the other. But Tirpitz's story is different. The Germans can claim her as a survivor of the Dresden, a reminder of the bravery of their sailors. The British can claim her as a symbol of their compassion and humanity. And anyone can claim her simply as a reminder that life, even in the middle of a war, can surprise you. There is also something poignant about the fact that Tirpitz was named after Grand Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, the man who had built the German Navy into a force that could challenge British supremacy. The real Tirpitz's ambitions had helped bring about the war. His policies had fueled the naval arms race between Britain and Germany, creating an atmosphere of suspicion and rivalry that made war more likely. And yet the pig named after him became a symbol not of rivalry, but of reconciliation, not of division, but of shared humanity. It is impossible to know if any of the sailors who cared for Tirpitz the pig thought about this irony. Probably not. They were too busy fighting a war, too tired and too hungry to spend much time on philosophical reflections. But we, looking back, can see the layers of meaning that have accreted around her story. The sinking of the SMS Dresden itself deserves a closer look, as it provides the context for Tirpitz's survival. The Dresden was a light cruiser of the Imperial German Navy, launched in 1908. She was fast and well-armed, designed for commerce raiding and reconnaissance. When the war began in 1914, she was stationed in the Caribbean. She joined Admiral von Spee's East Asia Squadron in the Pacific and participated in the Battle of Coronel in November 1914, where the Germans defeated a British squadron and sent 2 British cruisers to the bottom. It was a rare German victory in a war that would see Britain dominate the seas. But it was short-lived. A month later, at the Battle of the Falkland Islands, the British exacted their revenge. Von Spee's flagship, the Scharnhorst, was sunk with all hands, including the admiral himself. The Gneisenau went down as well, along with most of the squadron. Only the Dresden escaped, slipping away into the maze of channels along the Chilean coast. For 3 months, she was hunted. The British Navy deployed multiple ships to find her. The Dresden's crew was running out of food and coal. They were exhausted, hungry, and demoralized. They knew the war was lost, at least for them. Their only hope was to reach neutral Chile and be interned for the duration of the war. But the British were determined not to let her go. Captain John Luce of HMS Glasgow, who had fought at both Coronel and the Falklands, took the hunt personally. He had lost friends in those battles. He wanted the Dresden destroyed. When the Glasgow finally found the Dresden in Cumberland Bay, the German captain tried to negotiate. He argued that his ship was in neutral waters, that attacking would be a violation of international law. Captain Luce disagreed. He believed the Dresden had violated Chilean neutrality by using the bay as a refuge, which nullified her protection. He opened fire. The battle, if it can be called that, was brief. The Dresden was outgunned and outmatched. Her crew, knowing the end was near, set scuttling charges and abandoned ship. The Dresden sank in shallow water, her superstructure still visible above the surface. She remains there to this day, a popular site for divers, a rusting monument to a forgotten battle. Most of the Dresden's crew survived the sinking. They were picked up by British ships and by Chilean authorities. They spent the rest of the war in prison camps or interned in Chile. A few, including Captain Ludek, eventually returned to Germany after the war. Most faded into obscurity, their stories lost to history. But Tirpitz survived. And in surviving, she ensured that the Dresden would not be entirely forgotten. Every time her story is told, the Dresden is mentioned. The ship that was supposed to be her death became instead her pathway to fame. The broader phenomenon of animal mascots in war is worth exploring, as Tirpitz's story fits into a much larger pattern. Militaries around the world have long kept animals as mascots, companions, and symbols of unit identity. These animals serve multiple purposes. They boost morale. They provide companionship and comfort in harsh conditions. They become focal points for unit pride and tradition. And sometimes, they simply make people smile. In the British military, the tradition of mascots is particularly strong. The Royal Welsh keeps a goat as a regimental mascot, a tradition dating back centuries. The Irish Guards have a wolfhound. The Royal Air Force has kept dogs, cats, and even a bear. These animals are not just pets. They are official members of the unit, with ranks and uniforms and roles in ceremonies. Tirpitz was not an official mascot in this formal sense, but she functioned as one. She was cared for by the crew of HMS Glasgow. She became part of their identity. And when she was auctioned off, the money she raised enhanced the reputation of the ship and its crew. Other navies have had similar traditions. The United States Navy has had ship's dogs and cats. The German Navy, ironically, had several mascots during World War I, though none achieved the fame of Tirpitz. The Japanese Navy kept animals aboard their ships as well. In every case, these animals served the same purpose. They reminded sailors that they were still human, still capable of caring for something beyond themselves. But there is also a darker side to this tradition. Animals kept aboard warships were often in danger. Ships sank. Animals drowned. In some cases, animals were killed and eaten when food ran low. The line between mascot and livestock was not always clear. TIRPITZ herself was originally aboard the Dresden to be eaten. The fact that she became a mascot instead was a matter of luck and circumstance, not any inherent difference from other pigs. This tension between caring for animals and using them is central to the history of animals in war. We want to believe that the animals who serve alongside us were honored and protected, and in many cases they were. But we also know that animals have been worked to death, experimented on, and killed in large numbers during wars. The same military that cherishes its regimental goat also sends horses into machine gun fire. TIRPITZ's story is one of the happy ones. She was cared for. She survived. She lived comfortably. But her story should not blind us to the suffering of the countless other animals who were not so lucky. What do you like about this animal? Tell me your favorite animal war story I should talk about next. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video.